Transform all your company's milestones, big or small, into impact with Impact Hero. Whether it's a sale, a new hire, a demo booked, or anything else, with Impact Hero, you automatically generate a gift that matters, like a tree planted, a kilo of plastic recovered, or a piece of coral reef restored. Join the hundreds of companies that are already boosting sales and retention while making an impact. Go to impacthero.com/podcast now to get 10% off. Again, that's impacthero.com/podcast to get 10% off.
Welcome to another ClimateTech podcast, conversations with the people trying to save us from ourselves. In this episode, I spoke with Jonny Everett, founding partner at Marble. Jonny and the team at Marble are launching future climate tech gigacorns in sectors ranging from energy to materials to minerals. They're at pace to have launched 25 companies by 2025 and have gained a very loyal following among climate tech investors and influencers worldwide, myself included. I reached Jonny in Paris. Jonny, great to see you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ryan. Excited to be here. Excited to chat with you today.
So you're the founder of Marble, which you describe as a venture studio that combines talent with high impact ideas to fight climate change. And it's also Europe's only deep tech studio focusing exclusively on climate. Maybe just start with, what is a venture studio? Because this will be a new concept for some people.
Sure. So a venture studio typically describes a company that builds other companies. So in the world of, venture capital or company builders that are designed to support venture capital, you have different elements within that. So you have the traditional venture capital fund, and they focus on different stages, pre-seed, seed. People understand those quite well. Then you also have accelerators, which are typically for early stage companies where there's an existing team, there's an existing concept, and maybe they're at some stage where they would benefit from strategic advice, strategic support, resources, access to capital potentially. Things like Techstars would probably sit in that bucket. Then you have incubators. So these would be even earlier stage than that. But again, typically these are individuals with an idea or a concept or something that they are trying to do specifically, and they need help in doing that. And what venture studios do is start even before all of those processes. So we come in before there's a team, before there's often an idea, and in many times before there's any technology there whatsoever. So we're not looking, in our world as a venture studio, we're not looking for specific IP, we're not looking for specific technology. What we're really looking for is individuals that we believe, with the right help, support, and guidance, could find and solve an exceptionally large problem in climate. And venture studios come in many forms. So there's different flavors, different styles, different approaches. But what we do is really focus on this founder problem optimization piece, and only in climate technology specifically.
And how did you come to this? I hear about a lot of people who want to start companies. A lot of people want to start funds. I mean, this is very brave work, right? It's a lot tougher.
Whether it's brave or stupid is remaining to be seen, but yes, hopefully brave.
That's more of a horseshoe shape than a spectrum, I think, sometimes.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
But what were you doing before that? What's your background? What's your kind of education? I mean, how do you say, yeah, this person's going to be able to build a successful carbon sequestration company?
So let me start maybe with my background, and we can try and talk about how we know if someone's going to build a successful carbon sequestration company. So I'm British. I currently live in Paris, France, which is where Marble's based. My background is actually business. So I studied business at university. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And so I did what most people did and became a consultant. So I joined Accenture out of university, did their grad scheme. Fell out of love with that pretty quickly. I think it took me about under 2 years to realize that I didn't want to make spreadsheets and PowerPoints for the rest of my life, and was looking for an exit. I'd always wanted to start a company. Being an entrepreneur had been an appealing thing for me from a young age. My mother had been an entrepreneur. My father at some point had been an entrepreneur. My grandparents at some point had done entrepreneurial things. So entrepreneurship was something I was excited about, but I had no money and no idea. And so in that particular scenario, I didn't join a venture studio, which maybe would have been a better choice back in 2000 or whatever. But I met a guy who was a friend of a friend, and we just started talking. And one day he said, I'm going to start this company. And I said, cool, would you like some help? I'd love to join. And that was basically the level of depth and thought that I gave to quitting my job and trying to start a company. And so we built this company. It was in nothing to do with what I do today. It was in software and services. We were doing live chat and chatbots. So I was doing chatbots before it was cool, which is a mistake. So that's one thing, is make sure your timing is better than mine. But I did that for 8 or 9 years. And that taught me a lot, because that was actually a bootstrap business, right? And for anyone that's run a bootstrap business versus a venture business, these are two quite different organizations to kind of build. But we scaled that to about 120 people across the UK and the US. And then actually at the end of 2018, I had quite a catastrophic burnout and mental breakdown after that period. So I've been working extremely hard. I haven't been looking after myself for a long period of time. And my body caught up with me and said, okay, enough is enough. And that led to a 6-month period of taking time out. And part of that time out was realizing I didn't like what I was doing. I wasn't happy in my role in the company for a bunch of different reasons. And so I decided to exit that business and figure out what to do next. So I had no grand plan at that point. I was kind of put in that situation by needing to find a change. And so what I concluded was, well, look, I've spent the last 8 years building a company. The company's been pretty successful. I would love to work with other startup founders and see if there's something I could give back. I wasn't ready to start a company, right? I was in a position of kind of transitioning out of that thing. I didn't want to jump back into the trenches. So I looked for opportunities where I could help people start a company, but not start a company myself. And that kind of takes you naturally down the road of accelerators, incubators, and company builders. And I ended up applying to work on the program side of Entrepreneur First. So Entrepreneur First, for those of you who don't know, is another company builder, does large scale kind of cohort company building every 6 months. And for some reason, they said, yeah, we've got this role in Paris you could apply for. And I said, great, I don't speak French and I live in London. And they were like, don't worry about it. Like, we'll be in touch. And so I thought I was never going to hear from them again. But lo and behold, I did. And I did the interviews. And I think much to my surprise and the Paris team's surprise, I got the job. Between both of us, like, do you really want this job? Yeah, I do. Do you really want to give me this job? Yeah, we do. So I moved to Paris, did EF as a mentor, and then ran the program they call Form there, and just absolutely loved it. And a few things happened at EF that were quite transformative on my journey to ultimately doing Marble. One was I completely fell out of love with software. So EF was my first exposure really to these PhDs, postdocs, deeply, deeply technical founders who all seem to want to do things from a point of helping the world be a better place. And for those of people who've been in software, there's a lot of people who want to make the world a better place, but there's also a lot of people who just want to make a ton of money and just become really rich and famous, which is also okay. But I was just so enamored by the drive of these individuals and how mission-driven they were. And I found what they were doing so much more exciting and interesting and intellectually stimulating. So that was one thing. Second thing was, I actually found out that I could help them. I actually found out that all the things I'd learned over the last 8 years, all the mistakes I'd made, especially in the early stages, were very, very useful for them translating specifically their technical skills and thinking into commercial applications. So I was a commercial guy, right? I was in sales and marketing and these kinds of things. And I think that mindset really helped them cut through some of the noise and really think about how do we actually create a company around this technology, around this idea. And then the third thing was it gave me my first shot, I think, at doing something that is like non-bullshit for climate. And what I mean by that is something that isn't a software platform. I'm sure we'll talk about that later, but something that I could do for climate, get involved in a way that was meaningful and purposeful. And I decided that the best way of then doing that is taking all those things and package them into a place that was designed from the ground up to build deep technology companies in climate. So I started exploring that, speaking to some of the founders I knew who work in climate. And then one day, one of those founders said to me, I just met this guy called Ben Tank. You really need to have lunch with this guy. So me and Ben had lunch. This was back in, I think, 2020, end of 2020-ish. And it just happened that Ben was looking at building a deep tech climate venture studio in Paris, France. But Ben brought to the table all the stuff that I miss. So Ben is an absolute wizard when it comes to climate tech. He's like a Wikipedia of climate tech. I think he's one of the smartest people in the space, for sure, in my opinion. And I really knew that I needed someone like that, right? I wasn't coming from a huge amount of depth in this world at that point. And so I needed to find someone that could bring that sort of thematic thesis element, really dive into where should we build, what should we look to do. And Ben was actually looking for someone like me, right? Someone who was more on the operator, venture, entrepreneurship side. And so it was just a classic case of the universe aligning and us deciding to ultimately collectively take this journey forwards together and ultimately launch Marble in September 2021.
Okay, that's awesome. So, I mean, I would also argue that your consulting experience, so that even if you didn't like being there, you're used to jumping from one industry to the next and very quickly diving into like, okay, what are the moving parts here? What are the key drivers within an industry? So you combine that kind of experience with bootstrapping, and that feels like a really good like combo for starting a venture studio.
Yeah, sure. I hadn't pitched it like that before, but yeah, why not? I think, yeah, there is that, I guess, systems view. And I think the other thing that maybe I overvalue, but I think is useful sometimes is that if you understand what the objective is, but you don't necessarily get caught too much in, the whys and the wherefores, you stay quite focused on what are we trying to achieve here. I think sometimes having the kind of more technical inputs that we have from our science team and the people that really understand whether this is going to work or not. And then my kind of simplistic questions of like, how could we make this like cheaper, or how could we make this faster, or so on and so forth. I think that creates a nice balance between those two objectives that need to come together to build successful ventures in the space.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like there's more need for that in the sector. There are a lot of, as you say, scientists who are doing really great work that could probably change the world. And they need people like us who don't have scientific backgrounds who can be like, what does that mean? Like, dumb it down to kind of like
the so what questions. Yeah,
exactly. And I mean, it really matters. And this stuff is super complicated, and we need to find ways. We need to choose the right metaphors and agree on the right language, to the nomenclature to use within the industry, so that we can get this somehow mainstream, which is where the stuff needs to go. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about like how Marble actually works. So I know you work with 3 stages called explore, create, and build. Can you walk us through this a little bit?
Of course. So Marble, as we talked about, is a venture studio, and we focus on this idea of founder problem fit and optimization. So some venture studios actually bring founders in to work on existing ideas or concepts that are quite well defined and fleshed. We actually like to come in a step before that. So the way we start is actually by scoping things that we call opportunity areas. So these are areas within climate technology that we believe are yet unsolved, white spaces that really need to be solved. These are things we really need to figure out. And they're typically always going to sit in the bucket of hard to abate emissions, hard to abate sectors, and solving those really, really intractable problems. We identify those areas and we scope them, and we start to understand very well what are the key challenges, what are the key issues, and critically, what are the types of science or disciplines that could potentially unlock solutions in that space. So we have ideas already of jumping off points and directions of travel, and that's what we would call, I guess, an opportunity area. Once we have that space well understood and well defined, and we understand the types of science and the types of technology that could potentially find new solutions, we then go and try and build small cohorts of typically 5 to 6 first founders in residence to join us in what we call the explore phase. And in the explore phase, each of those individuals is coming to explore their area of opportunity, this intersection with their skill set and the climate impact that we've identified. And we take 3 months just to ask ourselves the question of what would be the most incredible thing that we could possibly think of doing that could offer a very total solution to this particular problem. So in those 3 months, a lot of that is technical ideation, whiteboarding, napkin economics, going really wide, and then starting over time to narrow in on a potential approach and technical solution that could offer something meaningful in the space. And at the end of 3 months, if we find something with that founder in that opportunity area, we then continue working with them into create. Create typically takes around 9 months. And really in that journey, we're trying to go from, okay, there's this kind of kernel of idea. There's a few things we've pulled together that we think could be interesting and exciting. There's an angle that we can see taking shape. How do we go from there to something that we can invest in a pre-seed? And so there's a lot more development of that into something concrete. There's a lot more customer validation, expert validation. We start to get really into the economics and the good old techno-economic analysis, the risk assessment. We understand how would we finance this company from pre-seed all the way to Series A? What are the milestones, the gates, the objectives that they need? How are they going to go to market? Who is their first customer? And critically, we also go and look for a co-founder. So if you remember, each founder is just working on their own idea. We want to bring in someone complementary to come and join them in that company to take that project forwards. Part of the reason we do that, Ryan, in a sequence rather than at the start, is it gives that first founder a lot more latitude into the different areas that they can explore and the different technologies that they could bring to bear in order to make that solution work. So if you have a founder in the first phase, for example, like we have in the past, looking at how do we solve for ammonia production, there are chemical routes for doing that and there are biological routes for doing that, right? If we'd immediately paired them in a team where it's like one founder who's a deep tech CEO type profile, one founder who's a biologist, they're going to only look in the biological solutions, right? So it's going to focus their thinking, sure, but it's also going to channel it away from other potential opportunities. So we like to give them maximum latitude. And then once we know what we're trying to build, it becomes easier to ask ourselves the question of, okay, who would be the dream co-founder for this particular project? And then we need to go and find that person. So once we've got the team assembled, we've answered all the key questions, we then hopefully invest in those companies. We invest 250,000, we target a 20% ownership at pre-seed. And when those companies are ready in the build phase, we then support them with hitting their next major financing milestone, which for some of those companies is additional capital at pre-seed. And for some of those companies is a fully priced seed round. And that's the end-to-end, I guess, life cycle of Marble. Obviously, we'll still be around for companies after that, but that's the kind of core focus of the program, is really to go from somebody who wants to do something about climate, wants to apply themselves, and taking them on that journey to have an incredible climate tech company that's financed, capitalized, and on the way to their next financing round.
And that initial funding from when the program starts or the cohort starts basically through to the 250K for the ones that are lucky enough to kind of make it through to that. Is that internal Marble funding? Do you have a fund basically? And would you also do follow-on stuff, or are you working in partnership with other funds on that?
Sure. So this first vehicle is Marble 1. So this is the first iteration of what we're doing. For this first vehicle, we raise capital from a combination of people. Majority of those are family offices and high net worth, but the largest single investor in Marble 1 is actually the Grantham Foundation, the venture capital arm of the Grantham Foundation. So for those of you who don't know, they're one of the, I guess, leading funders of carbon removal and increasingly just broad climate tech that's at the cutting edge. They invest about $150 million a year across both equity and grant finance to kind of catalyze climate solutions. They're our largest single investor, which is a great backer to have for what we're trying to do and the expertise that they can bring to bear. And so we use the capital that we've raised as Marble 1 to do two things. One is to invest pre-company. So this basically means the Marble team, the Marble operations, right? Making sure that everyone can get paid and that there's an office and all these other things. But it also means that during that exploration phase, we can pay the founders in residence. So each founder in residence receives a stipend in the first 3 months of Explore of €2,500, and in the next 9 months of Create of €3,000 a month. And that stipend is also available to any co-founders. And in addition to that, we also have some pre-program budget, pre-investment budget. This could be that they need to get some IP filed. This might mean that they need to go to visit a lab that they're going to work with. This might mean that they need to go to a really important conference for what they're trying to build, and we pay for all their flights, accommodation, et cetera, to do that. So we have this flex budget that we're able to deploy before we spin out. And then we have part of that capital reserved for those first checks. Now, in this first vehicle, we don't have any raised capital for follow-on, but our own investor base are all extremely active, either angels or venture capitalists in the space themselves in different roles and different hats. And so we're also able to hopefully participate in future rounds through doing SPVs and similar follow-on activities. And let's see what structure Marble 2 ends up having, hopefully when that comes out, 2026, I would imagine.
Interesting. I hope the founders aren't having to pay Parisian rent from those stipends. So geographically speaking, they're not necessarily in Paris. This is like a global program.
So about 50% of our founders, I think, are French. Doesn't necessarily mean they're living in Paris. The majority of our founders tend to try and live and work in Paris, but we don't mandate that. So some of our founders right now have been in Germany and Italy. We actually have quite a good representation from North America. We've had 3 founders so far immigrate for the course of the program. We're able to sponsor visas, which is a nice touch as well.
Interesting.
And then where those companies are ultimately built, we don't have a mandate on. So if those companies make sense to incorporate in the US and they want to go and set up operations there, they can do that. If they want to stay in France, they can do that. If they want to stay in another European nation, they can do that. So we're able to kind of flex on where we actually go and build those companies, which I think is important when you think about the ecosystem they're trying to enter.
I work with a lot of companies who plan to open up shop in or expand across Europe. My one big piece of advice: don't fall into the trap of setting up a new entity right away. Instead, talk to my friends at Parcar, who can help you get up and running without all the costs, not to mention the legal and HR hassle. When I was hiring in different EU countries, I wanted my team to focus on their work, not on the country's bureaucracy. After interviewing a half dozen international expansion firms, I chose Paracar because they were by far the most knowledgeable and they're great people. Whether you're a large multinational looking to expand abroad, a small business looking for the right talent, or a contractor, they'll sort it out. Book a free, no-obligation consultation right now at paracar.eu/climate. That's PARAKAR.eu/climate. I'm being facetious. I mean, I've seen actually how a little bit of monthly support goes a long way for at this stage and just takes the pressure off, because a lot of times when people are trying to do like the consulting work or the part-time job on the side, they're kind of, what is it called? Ego drain or whatever, that they're putting all their best thinking into that. And then you're expecting them to come up with the, world-saving ideas after hours. It doesn't work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
No, you don't need to be worrying about rent when you're trying to save the world. That's for sure. But I mean, even when I started my first company, I think the first year I had £1,000 a month in salary and no other support. So I also ate the dog food, as they would say, at some point. So hopefully it's sufficient now.
Been there, done that as well. I'm wondering, though, a little bit talk about Paris, because France does have quite a vibrant climate tech scene. They've got a lot of cool food tech companies doing interesting things. I saw that Umiami just in Paris just had a big raise recently. What's going on? Can you just kind of center us on the opportunities and the climate tech sector in Paris?
Yeah, of course. I mean, as a Brit coming to France, I had no idea what to expect, but I didn't have high hopes, right? When I was arriving in France, I think there's this outside perception that France is kind of where companies might go to die. And I think that that's like super misinformed based on what's happened over the last 8 years. But I must say, I also arrived with some of that expectation. I didn't have an idea that there was such a burgeoning, like growing scene happening in France right now. And I think a lot of that can obviously be traced back to Macron and his particular like pro-entrepreneurship, pro-business policy agenda that he's been driving. There's been a huge state capital investment, largely through BPI France, which is a state-backed bank, which deploys a lot of capital into the scene. And that's been very catalytic, both for the venture scene and also for early stage startups. But I think what I'm more bullish about personally on France and Europe more broadly is I think that there's just this massive arbitrage opportunity in the ecosystem today, where you have some of the top technical schools, some of the top universities in the world, you have some of the largest corporate actors in the world, but still we're lagging behind the US in terms of the rate of kind of large scale company creation in climate technology. And I think that if we can bring more, how should I term this? More, let's say, Anglo-American style of operation and ambition and scaling with the quality of European talent and opportunity that exists here, I think that's a powerful force that we can hopefully bring to try and catalyze the potential of this ecosystem and contribute to it. And already, as you said, there's stuff that's happening outside of Marble. We're just trying to play our part within that bigger ecosystem development and try and be a catalyst for exciting new companies to come out of Europe and beyond and offer a bit of a home for those operations.
I finished my MBA in Paris in 2006.
There you go.
And back then I would say it was still the 2-hour lunches with a bottle or two of wine, but I can see it's changed a lot. And, I've spent some time there in the past few years, and there's definitely from kind of the software as a service industry really built up. There's been some pretty big exits, some unicorns there as well. And I wonder if it's tracking at all like the way Germany is, where a lot of the kind of millennial entrepreneurs who started their companies in 2010, 2015, sold them in 2019, 2021, and are now setting up and anchoring their own funds in climate tech. It feels like every time I go online, there's a new climate tech fund in Germany. And I'm wondering if you're starting to see that happening a bit in the funding environment in France.
I think there's a couple of examples of that, maybe. There's one in mind that I don't think has launched yet that would fit that bill exactly. But I think something that is still being built in the French ecosystem is the deep tech climate capital piece in the VC ecosystem. I think that a lot of the ecosystem is still trying to maximize the software side of the equation and is kind of a few years behind that. But I think there's a similar narrative also in the UK to some extent. I think really there's some like exciting action coming from the US, of course, think there's some exciting action coming from Germany as well. But there are still, I think, a handful of funds that I would classify as being like deep tech climate. They want to take that technical scientific risk. They have PhDs on staff. They're really understanding the technical journey of these harder climate solutions. I think that's still not necessarily the bread and butter, even of every climate tech fund that we're seeing at the moment. And I'm excited for more funds to catch up and get involved in that adventure as well, because I think it's an important one.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cold shower for the VC industry right now that's in climate tech, that's realizing that it's different than software. It's not, we can invest kind of a little bit of money and then get huge payouts after 5 years. We're going to invest a lot of money and hopefully get huge payouts after 10 years or longer.
Yeah, I mean, I always enjoy meeting climate tech VCs, and I think, having capital into the space is always going to be net positive. I think that there is a surprising amount of misconception about the level and depth of risk in deep tech versus software. I think really the narrative is much more trading risk. So when you look at the statistics, the timeline for climate tech companies to get to, say, unicorn status is consummate with B2B SaaS, right? It's something like 7 years on average at the moment for a climate tech company to become a unicorn. And the other thing is about the perception of risk. People tend to think that physical stuff is going to be really, really hard. And yeah, it's hard, but it's just a different flavor of risk, right? Because if you're building a company, let's say, that's trying to do a certain type of fuel or trying to do a certain type of chemical, odds are you're going after an existing multi-billion-dollar market that's well priced, well understood. Everything's kind of well established. And so really what you're focusing on there is the technical risk. Can we get to this scale of supply at this price? That's the risk. I wouldn't worry as much about the offtake, right? Because there's going to be a huge market. If you can get to a certain price at a certain scale, you're going to be able to sell that stuff. On the other side, when you think about software, really what you're talking about is execution risk.
Yeah.
Right. So is there anyone that even wants to buy this thing? Right. So we can easily launch it. We can do AWS. We can do a landing page. We can integrate Stripe. We can be operating as a functional technical business very, very easily. And that technology scales very, very easily. But the risk is actually execution based and market based. So there's still a lot of risk, just a different flavor. And I think people sometimes overestimate one and underestimate the other.
And it's very hard to build a moat, right, in software these days for those very reasons. And so, I mean, I've seen, legacy B2B SaaS companies just lose their shirt overnight because Google just made a new feature that is their whole company.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that's not going to happen when you're investing $100 million in pressure vessels and bioreactors, right? It's different. The barriers to entry are higher, but the moat is deeper as well.
Of course. And I think as well, you have a very different revenue trajectory, right? Whereas, in software, you're looking at incrementally growing month on month, year on year, and you're looking for that kind of hockey stick type curve. In deep tech, you're much more likely to see nothing and then $100 million a year contract. And so I think it's just also understanding the different way that type of a company gets built. And in some way, I think we've forgotten how to build physical things. And you see this not just in deep tech or the perceived risk of investing in deep tech. You also see this in infrastructure projects just globally, that people are really struggling to figure out how do we build physical stuff. And I think people are struggling to figure out how do we invest and get healthy returns from physical stuff. But it's extremely possible. And I think it's also extremely exciting for the reasons we've just talked about. So hopeful the more people will get deep tech friendly as time goes on.
You talked about white spaces and focusing in on kind of some of these white spaces. I was giving you a hard time a few weeks ago on LinkedIn about looking at beef herd methane reduction deals.
Yes.
Which for me is a bit in the category of trying to make coal cleaner. And you made, of course, the valid point that beef consumption is tracking to double. And so we need to find ways to minimize the damage. But so it made me wonder a little bit, like, how do you choose? There are so many problems. I mean, literally, we're talking about the infrastructure of the entire planet, right? That's going to need to be shifted one way or another. And I wonder, like, have you selected, are there certain areas that are no-goes? Are there certain areas that you're most excited about? How do you kind of do that math?
So broadly, the thesis we talk about at Marble is hard climate problems. And for us, hard climate problems is where the solution requires new deep technology or science-based innovation to solve. So we're not interested in how do we scale wind and make it incrementally better over time, for example. We think that's a relatively solved problem and people are going to figure out how to do that. then we're interested in massive climate impact. And so when you're talking about either something to do with carbon, then it becomes quite simple, right? Is this like a gigaton scale problem? But you can also apply, I think, gigaton scale to other elements, like, for example, adaptation or even enablers. So if we're thinking about adaptation, is this affecting like a ton of people? Or is this going to be a very small scale thing that's only affecting a few people? And if you think about enablers, like, for example, for energy, you can also think about how is that thing going to be the unlock that allows something else that's climatically important to happen. So a good example of that is metals, right? If we can make a crap ton of copper in a way that's really, really effective, that's going to be a huge unlock for the electrification of everything that needs to happen. And then the last criteria we look at is this going to be venture scale? So is this going after a multi-billion-dollar opportunity? And typically, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, that intersects with the gigaton scale thinking, right? And we look for things in that sweet spot of the three. After that, we're happy to work across four main areas. So decarbonization, carbon removal, adaptation, and energy abundance. Anything within that zone that fits within those three circles, we're interested in building in. Right now, we've built 3 companies. We'll have finished another 4 by the end of this year. And the types of topics that we've built in, I think, are indicative of the types of things we're also interested in the future. So, for example, we have 2 fuel and chemical companies. We have a bio ammonia company. We have a reactive direct air capture company, so integrating direct air capture and CO2 conversion to produce methanol. And then we have a large-scale adaptation company, which is actually tooling and terraforming desert lands in the Middle East for agriculture, urban population, and solar. So they're the types of large-scale, I guess, ambitious projects that we're excited about. Things that we've been working on the last 12 months, we're covering topics such as ultra-low energy DAC, which we've heard all before, but we think we have something super exciting in that space. We're looking at hydrogen production through geologic hydrogen, so actually producing hydrogen from the subsurface rather than through water electrolysis. We're looking at ocean data intelligence. How can we get smarter, higher frequency, higher accuracy readings from the data for things like ocean CDR and other things? And we're also looking at biomineralization. So how can we actually draw down carbon through things like macroalgae, but then turn that macroalgae into useful products that we can use, for example, in cementitious materials? They're the types of things that we like to work on, types of things we like to build in, things that we're looking to for the future. So one is methane, happy to talk more about that, and specifically enteric methane, as well as I mentioned earlier, critical metals and minerals. We think this is a huge space and a huge unlock for a lot of other critical climate solutions that we need to build. We're also looking at agricultural adaptation, right? How do we build more sustainable agricultural crops, knowing that the world is only at the moment getting hotter and not cooler? We need to make sure that we can weather that curve, I guess you could say, and a whole bunch of other stuff coming out the back end. So we really try to prioritize these things based on what are we seeing in the ecosystem? What do we think is going to be hard to build outside of Marble as well? And where do we think we could really add value by creating a compelling company in that space?
I like the way you put it on your website, which is most importantly, we're freaked out about climate change, and we feel that supporting ambitious future founders is how we can maximize our contribution. I think that captures it pretty
sure.
well. Where do you hope to be 5 years from now? If everything goes well, what does Marble look like in 5 years?
5 years' time. So our objective at the moment is to build 25 companies by 2025. So hopefully we'd have had those 25 built and launched. And in 5 years, some of those will be hopefully having raised their Series A, let's hope, and will be on a good track to continue their scaling and growth and delivery of these important and urgent solutions that they're trying to work on. We will be in the second version of Marble, whatever that looks like. So whether that's going to be a fund or a sidecar or whatever, these are all things we need to think about and discuss, but that's going to be an exciting thing. And hopefully we'll have also been able to scale our reach, our impact, whether that means other geographies or not. I think there's a lot of different exciting opportunities for us to explore, both upstream and downstream, that support the type of work we're trying to do, which I think you could describe as being catalytic to the climate crisis. So trying to figure out how do we get more shots on goal? How do we get more people out of academia and industry and some of these slower moving organizations and into the fast-paced world of entrepreneurship, where we think it's a great vehicle for affecting change at scale quickly? I think if we take that lens of how do we be catalytic to the ecosystem, there are other angles of attack that we can also look at upstream and downstream, which we might kick off and launch. But watch this space. 5 years is a way off from here, so we'll see where we are then.
Jonny, if people want to follow or get involved with your mission, where's the best place for them to find you?
Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. I post there semi-regularly, not as regularly as I should, but feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. It's just Jonny Everett, Jonny, and then Everett, Everett. I have a Twitter, which I don't use much, but feel free to follow me. It's at Jonny Chats, or feel free to connect with us through Marble. So that's marble.studio for the website, and also all live careers and opportunities, including opportunities to build with us either as a first founder or co-founder, you can find at careers.marble.studio.
Thanks a lot, Jonny.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another ClimateTech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now. This episode is supported by Grizzle, B2B content to create and capture demand. I first met Grizzle's founder, Tom Watley, 5 years ago at a conference in Dublin. I was so impressed that I signed a deal with him to do all my software company's content that same evening at the pub. Remember that, Tom?
Kinda.
And they're still doing it 2 years after we sold the company because the new owners love Grizzle as much as I do. If you sell B2B, book 30 minutes in Tom's calendar at grizzle.io/climate. That's GRIZZLE.io/climate.